"You're fired." Margaret Hale's fingers froze on the ledger as Caleb Whitmore's voice cut through the ranch office like a winter wind. "Not hired. Fired." Before she'd even uncapped her ink. The legendary cattle baron stood silhouetted against the Montana sunset, all broad shoulders and cold authority, dismissing her as easily as dust from his boots. At 52, she'd crossed 1,000 miles for this position, bet everything on one last chance to matter. Now this man, this arrogant, granite-faced rancher, was taking it away because she didn't look like his idea of competence. But Margaret Hale had survived worse than Caleb Whitmore. Stay with me through this tale of two wounded souls finding each other when the world said it was too late. Hit that like button and comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The stagecoach had deposited Margaret 3 hours earlier, along with her 2 worn carpetbags and a spine that felt like it had been beaten with railroad ties. 18 days of bone-jarring travel from Philadelphia, through rail lines that ended in dusty nowhere towns, then onto coaches that seemed designed specifically to punish the human body. At her age, every jolt had been a reminder that she was no longer young, no longer resilient in the way society demanded, but she'd made it. That counted for something. The Whitmore Ranch sprawled across the valley like a kingdom carved from wilderness and will. Thousands of acres of grassland rippling gold-green in the afternoon light, cattle dotting the landscape like scattered pennies, and in the center of it all, a ranch house built from timber and stone that spoke of permanence. Of power. The kind of place where a woman might rebuild a life from the ashes of the old one, if they'd let her stay long enough to try. "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said now, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, ma'am." He didn't turn from the window. His reflection in the glass showed a face hewn from hard years, weathered skin, a jaw that looked like it had been carved with an axe. Gray threading through dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. 56 years old, according to the letter she'd received. Every one of them visible. "I asked Donovan to send someone competent. He sent you." The pause before that final word carried volumes. Margaret had been weighed and found wanting based purely on appearance more times than she could count. When her husband Richard died 5 years ago, leaving behind debts instead of the fortune everyone assumed, Philadelphia society had made their judgment clear. A widow past 50, whose body had never conformed to fashionable ideals, had no place in their drawing rooms except as an object of pity or contempt. She'd left that city gladly. But apparently, prejudice traveled west just as easily as hope did. "Mr. Whitmore," she repeated, moving to stand where he'd have to look at her properly. "Your former clerk, God rest Samuel Chen's soul, and I corresponded for nearly a year. He reviewed my credentials. My references. My experience managing accounts for 3 separate textile firms in Philadelphia, including one with operations surpassing your annual revenue by a factor of 4, that made him turn. His eyes were blue-gray, the color of winter sky, and just as cold. "Chen never mentioned you were a woman, he mentioned I was qualified. Does my sex invalidate 15 years of professional experience? It invalidates your ability to do this job." Caleb gestured toward the window, toward the vast expanse of his empire. "This isn't some Philadelphia parlor, Mrs. Hale. This is a working ranch. 1,200 head of cattle, 37 employees, suppliers and buyers from San Francisco to Chicago. The work requires riding out to line camps, inspecting operations, negotiating with men who'd sooner spit on a woman than shake her hand. I can ride." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "And I've negotiated with men who thought themselves my superior since I was 25 years old. Some of them even learned to respect me. Though I understand that may be a foreign concept here in the rustic West." His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. For a moment, she thought he might actually throw her out bodily. Instead, he laughed. Sharp and short, like breaking glass. "Rustic. That's one word for it, I have others, if you prefer." Margaret smoothed her practical gray traveling dress, ignoring the dust that had settled into every crease during the journey. "Mr. Whitmore, I didn't travel across a continent on a whim. Samuel wrote that this ranch was in trouble. That the accounts were a disaster of biblical proportions, his exact words. That the man who'd built an empire from nothing was about to lose it because he was too stubborn to admit he couldn't manage books and cattle simultaneously. Samuel had a big mouth, Samuel was honest. And from what I saw in the 30 minutes before you arrived to dismiss me, he was also correct." She picked up the ledger she'd been examining when he stormed in. "Your current system is catastrophic. You're carrying debt that should have been refinanced 2 years ago at interest rates that would make a Philadelphia banker blush with shame. You've extended credit to buyers who haven't paid in months. And unless I'm reading these figures wrong, which I'm not, you're approximately 8 weeks from insolvency." The silence that followed was profound. Outside, she could hear cattle lowing in the distance, the rhythmic sound of a hammer on metal from what must be a blacksmith's shop. Men's voices calling to each other in that rough, easy way of people who worked with their hands. Caleb Whitmore stood perfectly still, and Margaret suddenly understood what made this man legendary. It wasn't just his size, though he was tall and broad in a way that suggested raw strength. It wasn't the obvious wealth surrounding them. It was the absolute stillness he could command. The sense that he could wait forever for you to make a mistake, reveal a weakness, give him the opening he needed. She'd met men like this before. Powerful men who used silence as a weapon. Margaret had learned long ago not to be afraid of silence. 8 weeks, he finally said. His voice had dropped to something quieter. More dangerous. You determined that in 30 minutes, the state of your credit accounts was apparent in 15. The debt situation took longer because your filing system is. She paused delicately. Creative, Samuel organized it. Samuel, I suspect, was better with numbers than with order. Margaret set the ledger down gently. Mr. Whitmore, I understand your hesitation. Truly, I do. You built this ranch from nothing. You've survived droughts, harsh winters, cattle rustlers, and economic panics. You've fought for every acre, every head of cattle, every dollar. And now a stranger, a woman you didn't ask for, who doesn't look like your idea of competent, is telling you that your empire is crumbling. She took a breath. This was the moment. Either he'd throw her out, or he'd listen, but it is crumbling. And you know it. That's why you're angry right now. Not because I'm wrong, but because I'm right, and you hate that I can see it so clearly. Caleb's eyes narrowed. For several heartbeats, Margaret genuinely wasn't sure if he would grab her arm and escort her to the door, or if he might even strike her. His hands curled into fists at his sides, then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled out the chair opposite her at the massive desk that dominated the office. He sat down with the careful control of a man containing fury. Show me, he said. Margaret exhaled. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a chance. She opened the ledger to the page she'd been studying. Start here. These are your outstanding credits for cattle delivered to Chicago last October. Underscore 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 underscore. 3 hours later, the sun had set completely, and the lamp on the desk burned low. Margaret's eyes ached from squinting at Samuel Chen's cramped handwriting and the deliberately obscure way he'd recorded transactions. Deliberately obscure, she'd realized, because Samuel had been trying to hide just how bad things had gotten, to protect Caleb. Or to protect himself. Son of a bitch, Caleb said for perhaps the 20th time, staring at the figures she'd compiled. Mitchell hasn't paid a cent in 6 months. Mitchell has never intended to pay. Margaret rubbed the bridge of her nose, feeling the day's exhaustion settling into her bones. He's counting on you being too proud to pursue legal action, and he knows you can't afford to stop selling to him because you need the market access. I'll ride out there tomorrow and what? Threaten him? That's precisely what he expects. Men like Thomas Mitchell don't respond to force when they hold the superior position. They respond to leverage. Caleb looked up sharply. What leverage? Mitchell owes debts to suppliers across 3 states. If those suppliers were to suddenly demand payment simultaneously. She let the implication hang in the air. A coordinated effort would destroy him financially within weeks. He'd have to liquidate assets, including paying his outstanding debts to you, just to survive. How do you know what he owes? Margaret allowed herself a small smile. Because competent people build networks, Mr. Whitmore. Samuel and I corresponded extensively. He mentioned your problematic buyers. I wrote to associates in Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco. They wrote back. Information, it turns out, travels faster than stagecoaches. Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You did all this before arriving. I believe in being prepared. Margaret closed the ledger carefully. Though I'll admit, I didn't anticipate being fired before I could put any of it into action. That earned her something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Might have been. It vanished too quickly to be certain. I haven't fired you yet. No, Margaret agreed. But you're still considering it. I'm considering a lot of things. Caleb stood, moving to a cabinet in the corner where he extracted a bottle and 2 glasses. He poured amber liquid into both without asking if she wanted any, and slid one across the desk to her. You're not what I expected. Few women are, I find. We exist in the narrow space between what men expect and what they can tolerate. Margaret picked up the glass, recognizing good whiskey by the smell. Richard had liked whiskey. Too much, toward the end. The question is whether you can tolerate working with someone who might actually solve your problems. Is that arrogance or confidence, Mrs. Hale? Yes, this time the smile was unmistakable. Brief, but real. It transformed his face completely, knocking perhaps 10 years off his apparent age and revealing something almost boyish underneath all that hard-earned authority. Then it was gone, and the legendary Caleb Whitmore was back. All business. You can stay through the end of the month, he said. Trial basis. Prove to me you can handle not just the books, but this life. If by April 1st you haven't collapsed from the work or fled back to civilization, we'll discuss a permanent arrangement. It was less than she'd hoped for. More than she'd had 10 minutes ago. Margaret nodded. Fair enough. Be ready to ride out at dawn tomorrow. I want you to see the full operation before you make any more pronouncements about saving my ranch. He downed his whiskey in one swallow. If you can't keep up, the trial ends immediately. I'll keep up, we'll see. Caleb moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Without turning back, he said, Samuel spoke highly of you. In his letters. Said you were the best numbers person he'd ever encountered. Said you saw patterns others missed. Margaret's throat tightened unexpectedly. She hadn't known Samuel Chen except through correspondence, but his death, sudden, a heart attack at only 42, had hit harder than she'd anticipated. He'd been kind. Professional. He'd never once questioned her abilities because of her sex or appearance. He was a good man, she said quietly. Yes. Caleb's shoulders tensed. He was. Which is why I'm giving you this chance. Because Samuel trusted you. And I trusted Samuel. He left before she could respond, his boots echoing down the hallway until the sound faded into the sounds of the ranch house settling around her, creaking wood, distant voices. The ever-present wind whistling through gaps in the window frames. Margaret sat alone in the lamplit office, surrounded by ledgers that told the story of an empire built through sheer will and now teetering on collapse. She thought about her small room in Philadelphia, the boarding house where she'd spent the last 5 years invisible among other invisible women. Widows. Spinsters. Women who'd outlived their usefulness in society's narrow estimation. She thought about the look she'd endured on the journey west. The assumption that a woman her age, her size, traveling alone, must be desperate. Must be fleeing scandal. Must be something vaguely shameful, let them think what they wanted. Margaret Hale had survived Richard's debts, Philadelphia's judgment, and poverty that had almost broken her. She'd learned to balance accounts while hiding her own empty cupboards. She'd learned to negotiate with men who thought her presence in their offices was an insult to their masculine domain. She'd learned that survival required being useful. Being indispensable. Being so competent that your sex, your age, your appearance became irrelevant in the face of what you could do. Caleb Whitmore wanted her to prove herself. She'd proved herself to harsher judges than one cowboy with a ranch to save. Margaret finished her whiskey, letting the burn settle in her chest, then set to work organizing the chaos Samuel had left behind. She had until dawn to prepare for whatever test Caleb had planned. She intended to pass spectacularly. Underscore 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 underscore. Dawn arrived with the subtlety of a gunshot. Margaret woke to someone hammering on her door hard enough to shake the frame, a gruff male voice shouting, "Boss says you got 10 minutes, ma'am." Horse is saddled. She was dressed in 7, having laid out her riding clothes the night before. The dark split skirt was practical, if years out of fashion. The white blouse was crisp despite travel, and she'd packed it specifically for moments like this. Her boots were worn but sturdy, meant for walking Philadelphia streets, but they'd serve. Margaret pinned her gray-streaked brown hair into a tight bun that wouldn't come loose in wind or work, examining her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. 52 years looked back at her. Lines at her eyes and mouth. Softness at her jaw, her middle, her arms. A body that had borne a child who died in infancy, that had aged while others stayed perpetually young in memory. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd lived, survived, endured, good enough, she told her reflection, and headed downstairs. The ranch yard was already alive with activity. Men moved with purpose between buildings, their breath fogging in the cold morning air. Cattle lowed from pens beyond the barn. The smell of coffee drifted from what must be the cookhouse, mixing with livestock and leather and the clean scent of prairie grass. Caleb stood near the barn, checking the girth on a massive gray gelding. He wore the same type of clothes as his men, denim trousers, a faded work shirt, leather vest, and a hat pulled low against the rising sun. But something in the way he stood, the way men unconsciously adjusted their paths to give him space, marked him as the authority here. He looked up as Margaret approached, his expression neutral. "Assessing, Mrs. Hale. Thought you might sleep through. I've been waking before dawn for 30 years, Mr. Whitmore. Habit doesn't fade with age." Margaret eyed the horse a ranch hand was leading toward her. It was a bay mare, smaller than Caleb's mount but still substantial. "That's for me, unless you expected to walk." Caleb swung into his saddle with the ease of someone who'd been riding longer than walking. "Daisy's steady. Won't give you trouble if you know what you're doing." The skepticism in his voice was barely masked. Margaret approached Daisy calmly, letting the mare sniff her hand, murmuring softly. Then, gripping the saddle horn and gathering her split skirt, she pulled herself up. It wasn't graceful. She was too heavy for grace, and too old for the flexibility she'd once possessed. But she made it into the saddle on the first try. Settling her weight and finding the stirrups, she caught the flash of surprise in Caleb's eyes before he shuddered it away. "You said you could ride," he acknowledged. "I said I could ride." Margaret adjusted her seat, reacquainting herself with the feel of a horse beneath her. It had been years, but her body remembered. I didn't promise to make it look pretty. That earned her a snort that might have been amusement from one of the nearby ranch hands, immediately stifled when Caleb shot him a look. Let's go. Caleb turned his horse toward the open range. We've got 12 miles to cover before noon. They rode out as the sun lifted above the eastern horizon, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and amber. Margaret's body protested every jarring step, her muscles remembering that it had been 3 years since she'd last sat a horse, and then only for a brief afternoon ride in Fairmount Park. This was different. This was mile after mile of open country, the terrain rolling gently but constantly, demanding adjustment and attention. Caleb set a pace just shy of punishing. Testing her, Margaret kept up. They didn't speak. The wind carried the sound of cattle, the creak of leather, the rhythmic thunder of hooves on hard ground. The land seemed to stretch forever in every direction, broken only by occasional clusters of trees marking water sources, distant mountains purple against the horizon. It was, Margaret admitted privately, magnificent. Harsh and unforgiving, yes. But magnificent. After 2 hours, Caleb finally reined in near a creek where cottonwoods provided shade. He dismounted fluidly, then turned to watch as Margaret climbed down less gracefully, her legs trembling slightly as they took her full weight again. She refused to let him see her wince. How are you holding up? He didn't sound particularly concerned, just curious. I'm still in the saddle. That's what matters. Margaret led Daisy to the creek, letting the mare drink. The cold water looked inviting. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank deeply, not caring that it probably violated every rule of feminine deportment ever written. When she looked up, Caleb was staring at her with that unreadable expression again. What? She asked bluntly. You're not what I expected. He repeated his words from last night. You've mentioned that. Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. What exactly did you expect, Mr. Whitmore? A fainting flower? A Philadelphia socialite who'd collapse at the sight of actual work, honestly? He removed his hat, running a hand through hair pressed flat by its weight. Yes. Samuel never said you were practical. Such a careful word. Diplomatic. What he meant was, not young, not beautiful, not fragile, not any of the things women were supposed to be to deserve male protection and consideration. Samuel knew better than to lead with descriptions that don't matter. Margaret met his eyes directly. I assume he told you I could do the job. That should have been sufficient, should have been, Caleb agreed. But he didn't explain what had changed, what doubt had crept in. Come on. I want you to see the northern range before we head back. They rode on. The sun climbed higher, and with it the temperature, though nothing like Philadelphia's humid summers. This heat was dry, drawn from the earth and sky, carrying the scent of sage and dust. They crested a rise, and Margaret saw them, hundreds of cattle spread across the valley below, red and white and black, tended by riders who looked like toys at this distance. 1,200 head, Caleb said, pride unmistakable in his voice. Started with 23 years ago. Built this from nothing. From dirt and stubbornness. Margaret heard the unspoken question, and you think you understand what this means? What it takes, impressive, she said honestly. You should be proud. You've built something remarkable. Pride doesn't pay debts, no. Margaret studied the herd, doing quick calculations in her head. But at current market rates, even accounting for loss, that herd represents approximately $45,000 in potential revenue. Properly managed, properly marketed, that's enough to clear your debts and provide operating capital for 2 years. Caleb turned to look at her sharply. You calculated that just now. It's what I do. She urged Daisy forward, starting down the slope toward the herd. Numbers aren't mysterious, Mr. Whitmore. They're just information. And information properly used is power. She felt rather than saw him follow, his horse moving up beside hers. Samuel used to say something similar, Caleb said quietly. Samuel was a wise man. They rode among the cattle, close enough now for Margaret to see the brand, a bold W worked into an artistic flourish, and the condition of the animals. They looked healthy, well-fed. Whatever problems Caleb had with his accounts, he knew livestock. One of the riders peeled away from the others, approaching at an easy lope. He was young, perhaps 25, with sun-bleached hair and a grin that probably charmed every girl in whatever town was nearest. "Boss," he called, then noticed Margaret. The grin faltered slightly. "Ma'am, this is Mrs. Hale," Caleb said. "She's our new accountant." "Mrs. Hale, this is Tommy Brennan, one of my top hands." Tommy touched his hat brim politely, but Margaret saw the confusion in his eyes. "Accountant?" "Her, ma'am," he repeated. Then, to Caleb, "Everything's good here, boss. Lost sight of about 10 head near the western fence line, but they'll turn up. Always do, make sure they do." Caleb's voice held an edge. "Can't afford losses right now." Tommy's expression sobered. "Yes, sir. Word is." He hesitated, glancing at Margaret uncertainly. "Word is what?" Caleb demanded. "Word is that Mitchell's spreading rumors. Saying the Whitmore ranch is done. That you're about to go under, and anyone still doing business with you is a fool." The muscle in Caleb's jaw tightened dangerously. "Is that so? Just rumors, boss. Nobody who knows you believes. Rumors become truth if enough people repeat them." Caleb's voice was flat. Cold. "Get back to work, Tommy." The young man rode off quickly, clearly relieved to escape. Margaret waited until they were alone again before speaking. "Mitchell's trying to destroy your reputation before you can move against his debt." "I gathered that." Caleb didn't look at her, staring instead at his cattle with an expression that mingled pride and frustration and something that might have been fear, carefully controlled. "If buyers think I'm insolvent, they'll stop placing orders. If suppliers think I can't pay, they'll cut credit. The ranch can survive bad seasons, even rustlers. It can't survive losing trust, then we don't let him win." Margaret kept her voice calm, reasonable. "We move faster than he expects. We're not just some Philadelphia firm, we're boots on the ground, moving while he's still talking." Caleb finally looked at her. "We, yes. We." Margaret held his gaze. "You gave me until the end of the month. I intend to use that time to prove I'm not just competent, but invaluable. Which means your problems are now my problems. Whether you like it or not." For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like ocean waves. Cattle lowed their slow songs, and somewhere a hawk screamed its hunting cry. Then, slowly, Caleb nodded. "All right, Mrs. Hale. We'll play it your way." For now, it wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was acceptance, tentative and testing. It was enough. They turned their horses back toward the ranch house, toward ledgers and debts and the hard work of salvaging an empire from the edge of collapse. Margaret's body ached, her legs screamed protest with every stride. And she knew she'd be barely able to walk by evening, but she was still in the saddle, and somehow, improbably, she'd made Caleb Whitmore see her as something other than a mistake to be corrected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. New tests. But tonight, she'd proven she could survive one day in this harsh, beautiful land, one day at a time. That's how you built a life. Margaret Hale knew that better than anyone. Underscore 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 underscore. The ride back to the ranch took them through different territory, Caleb apparently intent on showing her as much of the operation as possible in a single day. They passed line camps where riders lived for weeks at a time. watching over distant sections of the range. They saw the spring where cattle watered, the maze of fences that divided grazing areas, the rough trails that served as the ranch's circulatory system. By the time the ranch house came into view again, the sun was lowering toward the western mountains and Margaret felt like she'd been beaten with clubs. Every muscle protested. Her back felt like someone had replaced her spine with rusted iron. Her thighs burned, but she stayed upright in the saddle until they reached the barn, and she dismounted without assistance, even though it nearly killed her. "You'll want a hot bath," Caleb said, dismounting with enviable ease. "Cook keeps water heating. Tell him I said you're to have first draw, thank you." Margaret handed Daisy's reins to the stable boy who'd appeared. "What time do you want to start on the accounts tomorrow?" Caleb paused in the act of unsaddling his gelding. "You're planning to work tomorrow, that is why I'm here. Most people would take a day to recover from that ride. Most people didn't travel 18 days to get here." Margaret straightened her spine despite the screaming protest of her muscles. "And most people don't have 8 weeks to prevent financial ruin. I'll be in your office at 8 o'clock, unless you prefer an earlier start." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Respect, maybe. Or just surprised that she hadn't collapsed yet. 8 is fine. He turned back to his horse, then added without looking at her, "You did well today, Mrs. Hale." It was, Margaret suspected, the closest thing to praise that Caleb Whitmore gave easily. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." She walked toward the house on legs that felt like water, refusing to limp, refusing to show weakness. Only when she'd reached her small room and closed the door did she allow herself to sink onto the bed with a groan that came from her very soul. Every part of her hurt, but she'd done it. She'd kept up. She'd proven, if only to herself, that age and appearance didn't dictate capability. Tomorrow, she'd prove it again. And the day after that, for as long as it took to make Caleb Whitmore understand that saving his ranch wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Because Margaret Hale hadn't survived the last 5 years just to fail now, she'd survived to live. To matter. To be seen as something more than society's cast-off, and this ranch, this harsh land, this difficult man, they were her chance to prove that some things only got better with age. Some things, like strength forged in fire and wisdom earned through pain, couldn't be rushed, couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be ignored. Margaret closed her eyes, letting exhaustion pull her under, already planning tomorrow's attack on the chaos of Caleb Whitmore's accounts. The battle had only just begun. Margaret woke before dawn the next morning, her body screaming protest at every movement. The hot bath the previous evening had helped, but nothing could truly prepare a 52-year-old body for 12 miles on horseback after years of city living. She dressed slowly, her fingers clumsy with the buttons of her sensible gray dress, and made her way downstairs through the still dark house. The kitchen was already alive with activity. A man she hadn't met yet, Chinese, perhaps 60, with hair more salt than pepper, stood at a massive stove, orchestrating breakfast for what must be 30 ranch hands with the precision of a military general. "You must be Mrs. Hale," he said without turning around. "I'm Wu Chen. Samuel was my nephew." Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a good boy. Too young to die." Wu's voice was matter-of-fact, but his hands paused briefly in their work. "He wrote about you. Said you were smart. Said the boss needed someone smart or he'd lose everything my nephew helped build. I'll do my best to honor Samuel's memory. Best way to honor him is save this ranch." Wu gestured to a pot of coffee on the back of the stove. "Help yourself. Breakfast in 20 minutes. The boss eats at 6 sharp." Margaret poured coffee into a tin cup, savoring the bitter heat, and carried it to the office where she'd spent her first evening. The ledgers waited exactly where she'd left them, and in the gray pre-dawn light streaming through the window, they looked even more daunting than before. She lit the lamp and got to work. By the time Caleb appeared at precisely 6 o'clock, Margaret had compiled a list of 17 creditors who needed immediate contact, identified 3 buyers who defaulted on payments, and discovered what appeared to be embezzlement, small amounts, but consistent, going back nearly 2 years. "You're Already working, Caleb said from the doorway. He held his own cup of coffee, steam rising in the cool morning air, plenty to do. Margaret didn't look up from her calculations. Did you know someone's been skimming from the feed purchases? That got his attention. He crossed to the desk in 3 strides. What, here? She pointed to the entries. Small amounts. $5 here, $8 there. Always from the feed supplier invoices. Over 18 months, it totals nearly $400. Caleb's face went hard as granite. Who, that I can't tell you yet. But whoever it was knew how to hide it. They waited irregular intervals, varied the amounts, and the handwriting on these entries. She pulled out several ledgers, showing him the variations. Samuel's hand here and here, but this one. Different. Trying to look like Samuel's but not quite managing it, son of a bitch. Caleb set his coffee down with enough force to slosh liquid over the rim. I trusted my people, most of them probably deserve that trust. But desperation makes people do desperate things. Margaret met his eyes. The question is whether you want to find the thief, or whether you want to stop the bleeding and move forward. Right now, you don't have time for both. That's my money, $400 over 18 months. Yes, it's theft. Yes, it's wrong. But Thomas Mitchell owes you $8,000. The bank is charging you usurious interest that's cost you thousands more. A supplier in Denver has been overcharging you for lumber by nearly 30% for 2 years. Margaret tapped the ledgers. Which battles do you fight first, Mr. Whitmore? Caleb stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw the war playing out behind those winter sky eyes. Pride versus practicality. Anger versus strategy. How did you find all this in one morning? He finally asked. I barely slept. My body hurt too much. She said it without self-pity, just fact. So I worked instead. And I'll keep working until we've stopped the bleeding and put this ranch back on solid footing. Why? The question came out raw, almost vulnerable. Why do you care this much? Margaret considered how to answer. She could give him the professional response, that this was her job, her pride in her work. She could deflect entirely. But something in his face, in the exhaustion that matched her own, in the way he stood in his office at dawn fighting to save everything he'd built, made her choose honesty instead, because I know what it's like to watch everything collapse while people who should help stand by and judge instead. Because I spent 5 years invisible, dismissed, treated like furniture by people who'd once called themselves friends. Because when Samuel wrote and said this ranch needed saving, it felt like maybe I wasn't useless after all. She met his eyes steadily. And because you gave me a chance when you didn't want to. That deserves loyalty. Caleb's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You're not useless, Mrs. Hale. No. But it took me a long time to believe that again. Margaret turned back to the ledgers before the moment could become too raw. Now, about Mitchell. I need you to write letters to 3 specific suppliers. They worked through breakfast, which we brought to them on trays. They worked through the morning as the ranch came alive around them with the sounds of men and cattle and endless work. Margaret drafted correspondence while Caleb signed, his bold signature a declaration of authority on each page. She explained her strategy: coordinate pressure on Mitchell from multiple directions, force him to liquidate assets to pay his debts, all while positioning Caleb as the reasonable creditor willing to negotiate. It's brilliant, Caleb admitted around noon, reading through the letters she'd crafted. Ruthless, but brilliant. Men like Mitchell understand ruthlessness. They don't understand mercy. Margaret stretched her back, wincing. These need to be sent today. Telegraph where possible, post where not. I'll ride into town this afternoon. Caleb stood, then hesitated. You should rest. You can barely move. I'll rest when the work is done, Margaret. He used her first name without seeming to realize it. and something in her chest tightened at the sound. You proved yourself yesterday. You don't have to work until you collapse, don't I? She looked at him directly. You're still deciding whether to keep me past the end of the month. Every moment I'm not proving my worth is a moment you're wondering if you made a mistake. I'm not. He stopped. Reconsidered. All right. Maybe I am. But you're not on trial every minute either. In my experience, women are always on trial. Especially women like me. Margaret organized the letters into a neat stack. You go to town. I'll continue working through the creditor list. We need to prioritize which debts get paid first to maximize goodwill and minimize damage. Caleb picked up the letters but didn't leave. Women like you, he repeated. What does that mean? You know what it means. Margaret kept her voice level, refusing to let hurt creep in. I'm not young. I'm not beautiful. I'm not the kind of woman men protect or value beyond whatever utility she can provide. So I make myself useful. Indispensable, if possible. It's the only currency I have left. That's the saddest damn thing I've heard in a long time. Caleb's voice was quiet, almost gentle. For what it's worth, Mrs. Hale, Margaret, I stopped judging you by your appearance about 3 hours into that ride yesterday. What I'm judging now is whether you'll burn yourself out before you can actually save this place. He left before she could respond, his boots echoing down the hallway and then out into the bright midday sun. Margaret sat in the silent office, his words reverberating in her mind. She wanted to dismiss them as meaningless, the kind of thing men said when they wanted something. But Caleb Whitmore didn't strike her as a man who wasted words on empty courtesy. Maybe he really did see her as more than a temporary solution to a desperate problem, or maybe she was a fool for even wondering. She returned to work, because work was safe, work was solid, work was something she understood completely. The afternoon passed in a blur of numbers and correspondence. Wu brought her lunch, which she ate mechanically while reading through supplier contracts. She found 2 more instances of overcharging, one case of promised delivery that had never materialized but had been paid for anyway. And a loan from a Denver bank that should have been illegal given the interest rate they were charging. By the time Caleb returned near sunset, Margaret had compiled a new list, this one of immediate actions needed, ranked by urgency and potential impact. Town was interesting, Caleb said, tossing his hat onto a side chair. He looked tired but somehow energized, like the ride had cleared his head. Sent your telegrams. Posted the letters. And I heard some things. What things? Mitchell's apparently been more than just spreading rumors. He's been actively trying to buy out my creditors. Offering them cash for my debt at a discount. Caleb's jaw tightened. Planning to call it all in simultaneously. Force me into bankruptcy so he can buy the ranch for pennies on the dollar. Margaret's blood went cold. When? Soon. Maybe 2 weeks. Caleb met her eyes. Your 8-week timeline just became 2 weeks, Margaret. The use of her first name again, the acknowledgement that they were in this together, steadied something in Margaret's chest. She looked down at her carefully organized lists, her strategic timeline, and made a decision. Then we don't wait for Mitchell to move. We move first. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Tomorrow, you and I ride to Denver. Denver. That's 2 days' travel, to meet with your bank. To refinance your debt at reasonable terms before Mitchell can buy it. Margaret was already writing, her mind racing ahead. We offer them something Mitchell can't, guaranteed payment over time from a functioning ranch. Rather than a quick profit from your collapse. We appeal to their long-term interest. They'll never agree. They think I'm already going under. They think that because they're hearing rumors, not facts. We bring them facts. Numbers. A plan so detailed they can't dismiss it. Margaret looked up at him. And we bring something else Mitchell can't offer. What's that? A woman who can make them believe in resurrection. She smiled thinly. Philadelphia bankers thought themselves immune to my influence too. Right up until they realized I was the only thing standing between them and total loss. Motivation is a powerful thing, Mr. Whitmore. Caleb studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You really think you can convince them? I know I can. Because the numbers support it, and numbers don't lie. Margaret stood, gathering her papers. But I need tonight to prepare the presentation. And I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. I'm starting to, Caleb said quietly. That scares me a little. Why? Because Samuel trusted people. He trusted whoever stole from him. And look where that got him, worked to death trying to hold this place together. Caleb's voice roughened. I don't trust easy, Margaret. Comes from building everything alone. From knowing that the minute you depend on someone, they can destroy you. Margaret understood that bone deep. I won't destroy you. Promise me that. It wasn't quite a plea, but it was close. Promise me you're not here to build something you'll abandon the minute it gets hard. I crossed a continent for this chance. Margaret held his gaze. I didn't do that on a whim. I did it because I have nowhere else to go. Nothing else waiting for me. This ranch, this work, it's everything I have left. So no, I won't abandon it. Or you. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither knew how to say. Outside, the ranch settled into evening routines. Inside, two wounded people stood in lamplight, circling the terrifying possibility of trust. All right, Caleb finally said. We leave at dawn for Denver. Pack for 3 days, in case we need to stay and negotiate. I'll be ready, I know you will. He moved toward the door, then paused. Margaret. Thank you. For caring about this place like it matters. It does matter, she said simply. Because it matters to you. He left, and Margaret sank back into her chair, her hands trembling slightly with exhaustion and something else. Something dangerous. Something that felt almost like hope. She couldn't afford hope. Hope was for people with safety nets and second chances. She had neither, but as she worked through the evening, preparing documents and arguments for Denver bankers, Margaret felt it anyway. Growing in her chest like spring grass through winter snow. Persistent. Unwanted. Undeniable. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time, being useful would be enough. The Denver trip changed everything, though not in ways Margaret had anticipated. The 2-day ride gave them time to talk, really talk, beyond numbers and strategies. Caleb told her about building the ranch from nothing, about seasons so hard he'd nearly given up, about the wife he'd married young who died giving birth to a stillborn son 15 years ago. Haven't let anyone close since, he admitted on the second night, as they camped under stars so bright they seemed artificial. Easier to be alone than to risk that kind of pain again, Margaret understood. She told him about Richard, about how he'd seemed so solid, so reliable, right up until his death revealed the catastrophic debts he'd hidden. About Philadelphia society turning their backs on her the instant they realized she was poor. About 5 years of invisibility punctuated by small humiliations. You're not invisible now, Caleb said, firelight casting shadows across his weathered face. No. But I could be again. The minute I'm not useful, stop. He leaned forward, his expression fierce. You're not some tool to be used and discarded. You're a woman with a mind that runs circles around most men I know. With courage enough to rebuild a life from ashes. That's not utility. That's remarkable. Margaret's throat closed. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him, but belief required more courage than she possessed. The Denver bank meeting was a battle. 3 bankers, all men, all skeptical, all ready to dismiss her the instant Caleb introduced her as his accountant. Margaret saw their eyes flicker over her, taking in her age, her size, her sex, and watched them decide she was irrelevant. Then she opened her portfolio. For 2 hours, she walked them through every number, every projection, every strategic decision. She showed them how Mitchell's rumors were lies, how the ranch was fundamentally sound, how refinancing at reasonable terms would guarantee them steady returns for years while Mitchell's scheme offered only short-term profit at long-term risk. She was brilliant. She knew it. The numbers sang for her, the logic was flawless, and by the end, all three bankers looked at her with something approaching awe. "Mrs. Hale," the senior banker said slowly, "I've been in this business 30 years. I've never seen analysis this thorough from anyone, let alone a woman." Margaret kept her voice pleasant, but steel underneath. "Let alone anyone," he corrected firmly. "This is extraordinary work. They refinanced the debt. Terms far better than Margaret had dared hope. By the time she and Caleb left the bank, they bought themselves breathing room, not prosperity, not yet, but breathing room. Time to implement the rest of her strategy." "You did it," Caleb said as they walked toward the hotel. "You actually did it, we did it." Margaret felt lightheaded with relief and exhaustion. "This doesn't solve everything, but it gives us a chance, more than a chance." Caleb stopped in the middle of the Denver street, people flowing around them like river water around stones. "Margaret, you saved my ranch today, not yet. But we're getting there, no." He caught her arm gently, turning her to face him. "You don't understand. If they'd refused, if Mitchell had bought that debt, I would have lost everything. 23 years of work, gone. You prevented that. You." Margaret looked up at him, at the raw gratitude in his face. And felt something shift in her chest. Something terrifying and wonderful and completely inadvisable. "It's my job," she said, but her voice came out rough. "It's more than a job." Caleb's hand was still on her arm, warm through her sleeve. "You care. About the ranch, about the outcome, about—" He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy with possibility. Margaret stepped back, gently dislodging his hand. "We should get back to the hotel. Tomorrow's another long ride, Margaret, please." She couldn't do this. Couldn't let herself imagine that the gratitude in his eyes might be something more. "Don't say something you'll regret when you're thinking clearly." "What if I am thinking clearly?" But he let her go, let her retreat, and they walked to the hotel in silence that felt thick with everything they weren't saying. That night, Margaret lay in her rented room and stared at the ceiling, her heart racing. She was 52 years old. Too old for foolish fantasies. Too experienced to mistake gratitude for attraction, professional respect for personal interest. Caleb Whitmore was relieved that she'd saved his ranch. That's all this was. Relief and gratitude manifesting as momentary warmth. By tomorrow, by the time they returned to the ranch and reality reasserted itself, he'd remember that she was just his accountant. Useful. Necessary. But still just an employee. She needed to remember that too, but as sleep finally pulled her under, Margaret dreamed of firelight and stars, of a man's voice saying she was remarkable, of hands gentle on her arm and eyes that saw her as more than useful. She dreamed of possibilities she'd thought dead and buried years ago, and when she woke, the dangerous hope in her chest had grown stronger, sending roots deep into soil she'd thought too barren to sustain anything beautiful. It was going to hurt when it died. She knew that, but for now, just for now, she let herself feel it anyway. The ride back from Denver should have been triumphant. They'd accomplished what seemed impossible just days before. Secured terms that gave the ranch genuine hope of survival. But the 2-day journey felt heavy with unspoken things, with the moment in the Denver street that neither could quite forget or acknowledge. Caleb rode in silence mostly, his face unreadable beneath his hat brim. Margaret matched his quiet, telling herself it was better this way, safer to let whatever had flickered between them die from lack of oxygen. By the time they reached the ranch on the third evening, exhaustion had settled into her bones along with something that felt dangerously like disappointment. "I'll see to the horses," Caleb said as they dismounted in the gathering dusk. "You should rest. Tomorrow we start implementing the next phase." "Of course." Margaret retrieved her bag, every muscle protesting. 3 days of riding had undone whatever adaptation her body had begun to make. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore," the formality hung between them like a wall she deliberately built. "Margaret." He said her name quietly, not quite a question but not quite a statement either. She didn't turn around. "Yes, never mind." His voice went flat again. "Good night." Margaret walked to the house feeling like she'd lost something she'd never actually had. Wu looked up from his kitchen work as she passed, his knowing eyes taking in her expression, but he said nothing. The old man was too wise to offer commentary on things that couldn't be fixed with food or practicality. In her small room, Margaret allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the weight of it all. The exhaustion. The confusion. The dangerous warmth that had bloomed in Denver and now sat in her chest like a coal, neither quite alive nor fully extinguished. Then she unpacked her bag, laid out her dress for tomorrow, and forced herself to sleep. She woke to shouting, not the usual ranch morning sounds of men calling to each other, cattle lowing, the organized chaos of work beginning. This was angry shouting, multiple voices raised in argument. Margaret dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Caleb in the office with 3 men she didn't recognize. Ranch hands crowded the doorway, watching with expressions that ranged from worried to furious. "Don't care what promises you made," one of the strangers was saying, a big man with a tobacco-stained beard. "Mitchell bought up our paper, and he's calling it due. You got 2 weeks to pay $1,500 or we take it in cattle. That's not the agreement we had, Carson." Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "I've been paying on time for 2 years, well, now you pay it all, or we take collateral." Carson spat into a tin cup he'd brought with him, the sound obscene in the tense room. "That's business." Margaret stepped forward before she'd fully decided to. "Actually, that's not business. That's breach of contract." All eyes turned to her. Carson looked her up and down with naked contempt. "Who the hell are you, Mrs. Margaret Hale?" "Mr. Whitmore's accountant." She moved to the desk, pulling out the file she prepared on every creditor. "And you are Mr. Henry Carson of Carson Feed Supply, currently in violation of a signed contract guaranteeing Mr. Whitmore extended payment terms through the end of 1887. The contract you signed. With your own hand." She produced the document. Carson's face went red. That was before Mitchell, before Mr. Mitchell illegally attempted to manipulate the market by buying debt instruments he had no legitimate claim to. Margaret kept her voice level, professional. "I trust you're aware that such manipulation, particularly when done with intent to force bankruptcy, is actionable under territorial law. The penalties can be quite severe. You threatening me?" Carson took a step toward her. "You think I'm scared of some fat old woman playing at business?" Caleb moved like lightning. One moment he was behind the desk, the next he had Carson's shirt front bunched in his fist, lifting the larger man almost off his feet. "You're done talking to her. You're done being in my office. And if you ever set foot on my land again, I'll forget I'm trying to be civilized about this." He shoved Carson backward hard enough that the man stumbled. The other 2 suppliers moved to support their companion. But their eyes showed more fear than fight. "We'll be back with the law," Carson blustered, straightening his shirt. "Please do," Margaret said calmly. "I have documentation of every illegal action Mr. Mitchell has taken. I suspect the territorial judge will find it fascinating reading. As will the federal authorities who oversee banking practices." That stopped them cold. Carson's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." "I never bluff about legal matters, Mr. Carson. It's inefficient." Margaret walked to the office door, opening it pointedly. "Now I believe you gentlemen were leaving." They left, but Carson's parting glare promised this wasn't over. The ranch hands dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves. Caleb stood rigid in the center of the office, his hands clenched into fists. "That son of a bitch," he said quietly. "Mitchell's moving faster than we thought. He knows we went to Denver. Someone must have told him. Margaret closed the door, suddenly aware that they were alone, that her heart was racing from confrontation and something else. He's trying to force your hand before we can consolidate. Can you actually do what you threatened? Take him to court, if necessary. Margaret returned to the desk, her mind already racing through legal strategies. But litigation takes time we don't have. We need to cut off Mitchell's leverage at the source. How? We go to him directly. Tonight. She met Caleb's eyes. We make him an offer he can't refuse because refusing will cost him more than accepting. He won't meet with me. We've been enemies for years, then he'll meet with me. Margaret pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, beginning to draft. As your representative, offering terms for mutual benefit. Mitchell's a businessman before he's your enemy. If I can show him profit in cooperation versus risk in continued aggression, you don't know him, Margaret. Caleb stopped, his jaw tight. He's dangerous. When he wants something, he doesn't stop. And he wants this ranch, why? Margaret looked up from her writing. There must be a reason beyond simple greed. Men like Mitchell always have reasons. Caleb was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. This land used to be part of his family's holdings. His father lost it in a card game 24 years ago to a drifter who sold it to me for practically nothing. Mitchell's hated me ever since. Says I stole his inheritance. Did you? I bought land legally from a man who won it legally. But to Mitchell, none of that matters. He wants what he thinks should have been his. Caleb moved to the window, staring out at the empire he'd built. He spent 2 decades trying to break me. This is just his latest attempt. Margaret understood suddenly. This wasn't business. This was personal vendetta wrapped in financial maneuvering. Which meant logic alone wouldn't work. She'd need to find Mitchell's pressure point, the thing he wanted more than revenge. Everyone wants something, she said quietly. We just need to figure out what Mitchell wants badly enough to let go of hatred, and if there's nothing. If all he wants is to see me broken, then we break him first. Margaret's voice was steel. I didn't cross a continent to let some bitter man destroy everything because he couldn't accept the past. Caleb turned from the window, and something in his expression made her breath catch. You're fierce when you're fighting. I've had practice, I'm starting to understand that. He crossed to the desk, leaning against it so they were at eye level. Margaret, about Denver, we don't need to discuss Denver. She kept her eyes on the paper in front of her, afraid of what she might see in his face. We had a successful business trip. That's all, is it? His voice dropped lower. Because I've been thinking about what I almost said. What I stopped myself from saying because I was afraid. Margaret's hand stilled on the paper. Caleb, don't. Why not? Because I'm your employee. Because you're grateful that I helped save the ranch. Because in a few weeks or months, when everything is stable again, you'll realize this was just, her voice cracked slightly. Just proximity and stress and relief that someone competent finally showed up. You think that's all this is? Caleb's hand covered hers on the desk, warm and solid. Margaret, look at me. She didn't want to. Looking at him meant seeing whatever was in his eyes, meant confronting the possibility that this might be real, and if it was real, then losing it would hurt in ways she wasn't sure she could survive, but she looked anyway. Because underneath the fear was something stronger. Something that whispered maybe, maybe, maybe. His eyes were the color of winter sky, but his expression was warm. Open. Vulnerable in a way she suspected he rarely allowed himself to be. I'm 56 years old, Caleb said quietly. I've spent 15 years alone because it felt safer than risking pain. And then you arrived, all prickly competence and hidden strength, and you made me remember that safety isn't the same as living. Caleb, let me finish. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. I'm not grateful you saved my ranch. I mean, I am, but that's not this. This is me realizing that somewhere between watching you refuse to give up during that first ride and listening to you demolish 3 Denver bankers with nothing but numbers and determination, I started seeing you. Not as an employee. As a woman. As someone remarkable. Margaret's throat closed. She wanted to believe him so badly it terrified her. I'm 52. I'm not beautiful. I'm not, you're strong. You're brilliant. You're funny in a dry way that catches me off guard. And when you smile, which you don't do often enough, it's like watching the sun come out. Caleb's other hand came up to cup her face gently. I don't care what you look like, Margaret. I care that when I talk to you, you listen like what I'm saying matters. I care that you fight for this place like it's yours. I care that you're here when you could have stayed safe in Philadelphia. I wasn't safe in Philadelphia. The words came out barely above a whisper. I was invisible. You're not invisible to me. His forehead touched hers, the gesture achingly intimate. You haven't been since the moment you stood in this office and told me my ranch was 8 weeks from ruin. Margaret closed her eyes, letting herself feel this. The warmth of his hand on her face. The solid presence of him, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and something uniquely him. The terrifying, wonderful possibility that maybe she could be wanted. Not needed. Not useful. Wanted, I'm afraid, she admitted, so am I. Caleb's breath was warm against her face. I'm afraid that caring about someone again means opening myself to pain. I'm afraid that you'll realize you deserve better than a rancher who's barely holding his empire together. I'm afraid that, she kissed him. Soft and brief, cutting off his litany of fears because if she didn't stop him, she'd drown in her own. For a moment, neither moved. Then Caleb made a sound low in his throat and kissed her back, his hands gentle on her face, his mouth warm and searching and perfectly careful, like he was afraid she might break. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Margaret's whole body felt like it was vibrating with something she didn't have words for, that was. Caleb started, a mistake, Margaret finished, but without conviction, the hell it was. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face from hard-edged authority to something almost boyish. That was possibly the best decision either of us has made in years, Margaret laughed, surprised by the sound coming from her own throat. We're in the middle of a crisis. Mitchell's moving against us. We have 2 weeks to save this ranch, yes. But we also have right now. Caleb's thumb traced her cheekbone. And right now, I want to be honest with you. I'm drawn to you, Margaret. Have been since you refused to be intimidated by me. And it's not gratitude, and it's not proximity. It's you. I don't know how to do this, Margaret whispered. I haven't. Richard was the only man I ever, and that was 30 years ago. I don't know how to be wanted. How to trust that it's real. Then we figure it out together. Slowly. Caleb stepped back, giving her space but not distance. No expectations. No pressure. Just, honesty. Can you give me that? Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Her lips still tingled from the kiss. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Everything felt too bright, too sharp, too impossibly fragile. The office door burst open. Tommy Brennan stood there, his young face flushed and frightened. Boss, we got trouble. Big trouble. Caleb's transformation was instant, the vulnerable man gone, replaced by the rancher in crisis mode. What happened? Carson and his boys didn't leave. They went to the north pasture and started cutting out cattle. Said they were taking collateral. When Jake tried to stop them, Tommy swallowed hard. Jake's hurt bad. We need the doctor, son of a bitch. Caleb was moving before Tommy finished speaking, grabbing his gun belt from the wall hook. How many men does Carson have? 6 that we counted. They're armed, round up everyone you can trust. Tell them, no. Margaret's voice cut through the chaos. Both men turned to stare at her. Violence is exactly what Mitchell wants. Carson's just following orders, and if you shoot him or his men, you'll give Mitchell legal grounds to have you arrested. You'll lose everything. They attacked my man, Caleb said through gritted teeth. And we'll pursue that through legal channels. But right now, we use the law, not guns. Margaret was already moving toward the door. Tommy, take me to Carson. Now, ma'am, those men are dangerous, so am I, when necessary. Margaret looked at Caleb. Trust me. Please, she saw the war in his eyes. The instinct to protect versus the need to trust. The desire to solve this with force versus the knowledge that she might be right. Take 6 men with you, he finally said. Armed, but they don't fire unless fired upon. And Margaret? Be careful, always. She touched his arm briefly, a promise and a connection, then followed Tommy out into the bright afternoon. The ride to the north pasture took 20 minutes. And with every stride, Margaret's mind raced through strategies. Carson was a bully and a cheat, but he was also a businessman. Every businessman had a weakness. She just needed to find it fast. They crested a rise and saw the scene below. Carson and 5 men had cut out approximately 20 head of cattle and were trying to herd them toward the property line. Jake lay on the ground nearby, one of the ranch hands kneeling beside him. Even from this distance, Margaret could see blood. Wait here, she told Tommy and the others. If I signal, come down. Not before, ma'am, you can't. I can, and I will. Margaret urged her horse forward, down the slope, alone. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands stayed steady on the reins. Fear was useful. Panic was not. Carson saw her coming and laughed, the sound ugly. What's this? Whitmore sending a woman to do his fighting. Mr. Whitmore is choosing not to escalate into violence that would benefit only Thomas Mitchell, Margaret said, keeping her horse between herself and the injured Jake. Which shows more wisdom than you're displaying. I'm taking what I'm owed. You're stealing cattle based on a debt that isn't yet due, using force against employees, and committing at least 3 territorial crimes. Margaret kept her voice level. All while being observed by 7 witnesses from multiple angles. Mr. Whitmore chose not to have those witnesses armed because he understands the law. Do you? I understand Mitchell owns my business if I don't deliver. Carson spat. So I'm delivering. What if I offered you something better? Margaret edged her horse forward slightly. What if I could show you how to keep your business without becoming Mitchell's puppet? How to clear your actual debt to Mr. Whitmore while maintaining your independence? Carson's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing again, no. I'm offering a negotiated settlement. Margaret pulled papers from her saddlebag, the ones she'd prepared that morning before Carson's intrusion. Your debt to Mr. Whitmore is legitimate. But the terms Mitchell offered you are predatory. He's using you to destroy a competitor. And when you've served your purpose, he'll destroy you too. That's nonsense, is it? Mitchell has a pattern. He approaches struggling businesses, offers them temporary relief, then uses their gratitude to manipulate them into actions that serve only him. When they're no longer useful, he calls in his debts at rates that force bankruptcy. Margaret held up the papers. I have documentation of 6 businesses he's destroyed this way in the last decade. 3 right here in this territory. Carson's confidence wavered slightly. What are you offering? A payment plan that actually works. 3 years to pay off your debt at manageable quarterly installments. In exchange, you return these cattle. Drop any claim to collateral, and sign a statement detailing Mitchell's attempted manipulation of our business relationship. Mitchell will ruin me. Mitchell will ruin you anyway, the moment you're not useful. This way, at least you have a chance. Margaret kept her voice steady, though her hands wanted to shake. Think, Mr. Carson. Do you really want to tie your future to a man who sees you as a disposable tool? The silence stretched. Behind Carson, his men shifted uneasily. One of them, a younger man who looked vaguely familiar, spoke up. Pa, maybe we should listen. Mitchell's not exactly known for keeping his word, so Carson's son worked for him. Family business. That changed the calculation slightly. Your son's right, Margaret said quietly. You're not doing this for greed. You're doing it because you're afraid for your family. I understand that. Mr. Whitmore understands it too. Which is why he's willing to offer terms that protect your business instead of destroying it. Carson stared at her for a long moment. Margaret held her breath, very aware of the injured man behind her, of the watching witnesses, of Caleb back at the ranch waiting to hear if she'd succeeded or failed. Let me see those papers, Carson finally growled. Margaret dismounted carefully and approached, handing him the documents she'd prepared. He read slowly, his lips moving slightly. His son read over his shoulder. The other men waited, hands near their guns but not on them. This is legitimate? Carson asked finally, every word. Witnessed by a Denver attorney, enforceable in territorial court. Margaret met his eyes. Mr. Whitmore doesn't want enemies. He wants his ranch to survive. This arrangement benefits both of you, and the part about Mitchell, optional. But it would help ensure he can't retaliate against you later. Margaret kept her voice gentle. Mr. Carson, you're not a bad man. You're a frightened one. I recognize that because I've been frightened too. But fear makes us do things we regret. Don't let Mitchell push you into something you'll have to live with forever. Carson looked at his son. Some silent communication passing between them. Then he looked at Jake, still on the ground, still bleeding. Something in his face shifted. We didn't mean for it to go that far, he said quietly. Jake tried to stop us. My cousin Marcus hit him harder than necessary, I know. Margaret did know. She'd seen enough desperation to recognize the difference between malice and panic. Help me get him to the doctor, sign these papers, and we never speak of this again. Carson nodded slowly. All right. All right, Mrs. Hale. You got yourself an agreement. The relief that flooded through Margaret was so intense she felt dizzy. But she kept her face calm, professional, as Carson signed the documents. As his men helped load Jake onto a horse for transport to town, as the stolen cattle were returned to the herd, only when they were riding back toward the ranch house, Tommy beside her with an expression of awed disbelief, did Margaret allow herself to shake. Ma'am, Tommy said quietly, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen. That was necessity, Margaret corrected. Bravery is doing something when you have a choice. I didn't have a choice, still brave. Tommy grinned. Wait until the boys hear how you faced down Carson without even flinching. Margaret didn't bother correcting him that she'd been flinching internally the entire time. Let him have his hero story. Cowboys seem to need them. Caleb met them in the ranch yard, his face tight with controlled anxiety. Jake, alive. Being taken to the doctor. Concussion probably, maybe some broken ribs. Margaret dismounted, her legs trembling from adrenaline crash. Carson signed the agreement. The cattle are returned, you did it. Caleb stared at her like she'd performed some kind of miracle. You actually did it, I did what was necessary. Margaret handed him the signed documents, trying to ignore how her hands shook. Though we still have the Mitchell problem. Carson was just a symptom, we'll deal with Mitchell. Caleb's hands closed around hers, steadying them. Right now, I need to see for myself that you're all right. I'm fine, you're shaking, adrenaline. Margaret tried to pull away, aware of the ranch hands watching. Caleb, people are, I don't care. He pulled her closer, not quite an embrace but more than professional distance. You rode down there alone. You could have been killed, but I wasn't. And we got what we needed, at what cost? His voice was rough. Margaret, don't do that again. Don't risk yourself like that. I'll do whatever is necessary to save this ranch. She met his eyes. That's what you hired me for. I hired you to manage accounts. Not to be my negotiator in life-threatening situations. Caleb's jaw was tight. There's a difference between useful and indispensable. And you need to understand that he stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say hung between them, too important for a ranch yard full of witnesses. Tonight, he said instead. After supper. Meet me in the office. It wasn't a request. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She spent the afternoon putting the Carson documents in order, drafting the next phase of their strategy against Mitchell. But part of her mind kept circling back to that interrupted sentence, to the look in Caleb's eyes, to the way he touched her hands like he was afraid she might disappear. This was getting complicated. More complicated than she'd ever intended, and the terrifying part was that she didn't want to stop it. Evening came with the slow fade of light across the prairie, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Margaret stood at her bedroom window watching the sunset, her stomach tight with anticipation and something that felt dangerously like longing. In a few minutes, she'd go downstairs to the office where Caleb waited, and they'd finish whatever conversation had been interrupted in the ranch yard. She wasn't sure she was ready for it, but she went anyway, because Margaret Hale had learned long ago that avoiding difficult conversations only made them harder. Better to face things directly, even when your hands trembled and your heart felt like it might break. The office door was open. Caleb stood at the window, silhouetted against the dying light, and for a moment Margaret just watched him. The broad shoulders that carried the weight of an empire. The weathered hands that had built something from nothing. The stillness that spoke of hard-won control over whatever churned beneath the surface. He turned as she entered, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "Close the door," he said quietly. Margaret did, her pulse hammering. The office suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, the lamp on the desk casting warm shadows that seemed to wrap around them both. "About this afternoon," Caleb started, then stopped. Ran a hand through his hair. "Hell, I'm no good at this." "Haven't had to be in 15 years, you don't have to be good at it." Margaret moved closer, drawn despite her better judgment. "Just honest, honest." He laughed without humor. "All right. Honestly?" "When Tommy came back and said you'd ridden down there alone, my heart stopped. Actually stopped. And I realized that somewhere in the last few weeks, you became more than someone I hired. More than someone useful, Caleb. Let me finish before I lose my nerve." He crossed to her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at his eyes, the gray threading through his hair, all the marks of years lived hard. "I told you in Denver that you made me remember living isn't the same as being safe. What I didn't tell you is that watching you today, watching you risk yourself for this ranch, made me understand I don't want to live without you anymore." Margaret's throat closed. "You barely know me. I know you're brave when you're terrified. I know you're brilliant when everyone underestimates you. I know you care about this place and these people with a fierceness that takes my breath away." His hands came up to frame her face. Gentle and sure. "I know that when I imagine the future now, you're in it. And I don't know when that happened, but it did. This is too fast." But Margaret didn't pull away. "We're in crisis. Everything feels heightened. When things settle down, when the ranch is stable again, you might feel differently. You think I'm confused?" Caleb's thumbs brushed her cheekbones. "Margaret, I've spent 15 years alone by choice. I know the difference between gratitude and wanting someone. Between needing help and needing a person." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "What I don't know is if you feel the same. If this is just me, or if somewhere in you there's a possibility." She kissed him again. Harder this time, her hands fisting in his shirt. Not because she had words for what she felt, but because she didn't, because the only truth she could offer was in this, in the way her body responded to his nearness, in the ache that bloomed in her chest when he touched her, in the terrifying want that she'd thought dead and buried years ago. Caleb made a sound against her mouth, his arms coming around her, pulling her close. The kiss deepened, no longer careful or testing but urgent, hungry, expressing everything neither knew how to say. Margaret felt the solid warmth of him, the strength in hands that held her like she was precious, the thunder of his heart against hers, when they finally broke apart. Both breathing hard, Caleb pressed his forehead to hers. "Is that a yes? I don't know what it is." Margaret's voice shook. "I'm 52 years old. I haven't, it's been so long since anyone wanted me like this. Since I let myself want anything. And I'm terrified because what if you're right? What if this is real? I don't know how to trust that without waiting for it to be taken away, then we take it slow." Caleb's hands moved to her shoulders, steadying. "No rushing. No expectations. We figure this out together, one day at a time." "Can you do that?" Margaret looked up at him, at the vulnerability in his eyes that matched her own, and felt something in her chest crack open. Not break. Open. Like winter ice giving way to spring. "I can try," she whispered, "that's all I'm asking." He kissed her forehead gently, then stepped back, giving her space. "Now, tell me about the Carson documents. Because as much as I'd like to spend the evening doing this, we still have a ranch to save." The shift to business was abrupt but somehow perfect. It reminded Margaret that whatever was growing between them existed alongside the work, not instead of it. They could be partners in both senses, if they were brave enough. She retrieved the papers from the desk, settling into the familiar comfort of numbers and strategy. "Carson's cooperation gives us leverage. His statement about Mitchell's manipulation tactics, combined with the bank refinancing, puts us in position to move against him legally. Legally takes months." Caleb leaned against the desk beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "We have 2 weeks before Mitchell tries something else, which is why we don't just go legal. We go public." Margaret pulled out another document she'd been drafting. "The territorial newspaper in Helena. We give them the full story. Mitchell's predatory lending. His attempts to manipulate the market. The illegal coordination to force bankruptcy. It's all documented now." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That'll destroy his reputation, yes. But more importantly, it'll make any judge or banker who touches him afterward look complicit. He'll be toxic. Isolated." Margaret met his eyes. "Is that too ruthless, after what he tried today? What he's been trying for 2 decades? Caleb shook his head. "No. It's justice. Or close enough." They worked through the evening, drafting the statement for the newspaper, organizing evidence, building a case that would bury Thomas Mitchell's schemes so thoroughly he'd never threaten the ranch again. At some point Wu brought them coffee and sandwiches. At another point, Caleb's hand found Margaret's, their fingers lacing together while they debated wording, the touch as natural as breathing. Near midnight, Margaret finally set down her pen, exhaustion pulling at her. "That's everything. We send this to Helena tomorrow, and within a week, Mitchell will be finished, thanks to you." Caleb squeezed her hand gently. "I couldn't have done any of this alone. You would have found a way. You always do, maybe. But it wouldn't have been this good. And I wouldn't have." He stopped, looking at their joined hands. "I wouldn't have found this." Margaret's chest tightened. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that matched the weight of the moment, but before she could find the words, raised voices erupted from outside. Not ranch work voices. Angry voices. Frightened voices. They both stood immediately, Caleb's hand going to the gun he'd strapped on earlier. They rushed to the window and saw flames. The barn, the massive structure that housed 30 horses and stored months of feed, was burning, son of a bitch." Caleb was moving before Margaret could respond, racing for the door. "Mitchell," Margaret followed, her mind already calculating losses. The horses alone represented thousands of dollars. The feed was irreplaceable this late in the season. And if the fire spread to the hay storage beyond, outside, chaos ruled. Men ran with buckets from the well, forming a chain toward the barn. Others led panicked horses from the burning structure, the animals wild-eyed and screaming. Wu stood on the porch, his face grim, a rifle in his hands. Started at the north corner, he called to Caleb over the roar of flames. Too organized to be accident, how many horses still inside? Caleb was already stripping off his gun belt, preparing to run into the inferno. 4. Maybe 5. Back stalls. Tommy appeared, his face soot-stained. "Boss, you can't." "The hell I can't." Caleb shoved his gun into Tommy's hands. "Keep the fire from spreading to the hay storage. That's more valuable than the barn." "Caleb, no." Margaret grabbed his arm. "If you die in there, if those horses die, we lose what little advantage we have left. Mitchell's counting on this destroying us. I won't let him win." Caleb pulled free, his eyes fierce. "Trust me." Then he ran into the burning barn, disappearing into smoke and flame, and Margaret's heart stopped. Just stopped, the way it hadn't stopped for anything in years, because the man she just admitted she might care about was risking his life for horses, for the ranch, for his pride. "Damn him," she whispered, then louder, to the nearest ranch hand, "I need wet blankets and 2 men who aren't cowards." "Ma'am, you can't. I didn't ask for opinions. I asked for blankets and men." Margaret's voice cut like glass. Now, 3 men moved immediately, recognizing authority when they heard it. Within minutes, Margaret was wrapped in a soaking blanket, surrounded by 2 ranch hands similarly covered. And moving toward the barn entrance. The heat was enormous, pressing against her like a physical force. Smoke made her eyes water, her lungs burn, but Caleb was in there. And she'd be damned if she let him die alone. They found him in the back stalls, trying to calm a mare too terrified to move. 2 other horses lay on the ground, overcome by smoke. Caleb's face was black with soot, his eyes streaming, but he didn't stop working. "Get those 2 out," he shouted over the roar of flames. "I'll get her." Margaret and the ranch hands grabbed the fallen horses, dragging them with strength born of desperation toward the entrance. The heat was unbearable. Flames licked at the walls, the roof beams groaning ominously. Margaret's lungs felt like they were on fire, every breath agony. They made it outside, depositing the horses far enough from the barn to be safe. Men immediately began trying to revive them. Margaret turned back toward the inferno. "Ma'am, no." Someone tried to stop her. She shook them off and ran back inside. Caleb had gotten the mare moving, but slowly, the animal's fear making her stumble. The roof groaned again, louder. Margaret didn't think. She grabbed the mare's halter from the other side, adding her weight to pulling the terrified animal forward. "Margaret, get out." Caleb's voice was raw. "The roof's going to." A beam fell behind them with a crash that shook the ground. Sparks exploded upward. The mare finally spooked forward, and they ran, all 3 of them, racing fire and collapse and death. They burst from the barn seconds before the roof caved in with a roar like thunder. The mare kept running until she reached the other horses. Margaret and Caleb collapsed on the ground, coughing, gasping, their lungs burning with smoke and heat. Someone poured water over them. Someone else wrapped blankets around their shoulders. Wu's face appeared above Margaret, his expression furious and frightened. "Stupid woman," he said, which Margaret took as a term of endearment. "You could have died." Caleb was in there. It was the only explanation Margaret had. The only one that mattered. Across from her, Caleb met her eyes through the smoke and chaos. His face was black with soot, his hands burned in places, but he was alive. They were both alive, "You came back for me," he said hoarsely. "Of course I did." Margaret's voice was wrecked. "You think I'd let Mitchell kill you after I worked this hard to save your ranch?" He laughed, the sound turning into a cough. "Is that the only reason?" "No." Margaret held his gaze. "No, that's not the only reason." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things, with the acknowledgement that they'd both just risked their lives, not for the ranch, but for each other. Then Tommy was there, helping Caleb to his feet. Wu hauled Margaret up with surprising strength. The barn burned behind them, a total loss, but the hay storage remained untouched. The horses were alive. The ranch would survive. "Mitchell did this," Caleb said, his voice cold fury. "This is a declaration of war, then we finish it." Margaret's voice was just as cold. "Tomorrow, we take everything we have to Helena. To the newspaper, to the territorial judge, to anyone who'll listen. And we destroy him so completely he'll never threaten another soul." That could take weeks. Months. Caleb's jaw was tight. "Meanwhile, he's free to know. There's a faster way." Margaret's mind was already working through the pieces, seeing the pattern. "We go to him directly. Tonight. We show him everything we have, everything we're prepared to do. And we give him one chance to walk away before we bury him. He'll never take it, then he's destroyed. But we offer anyway. Because that's the difference between us and him. We give people chances to do the right thing." Margaret looked at the burning barn, at the ranch hands fighting to save what they could, at Caleb's soot-stained face. "But if he refuses, we show no mercy." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "You're terrifying when you're angry." "Good. Mitchell should be terrified." Margaret started toward the house, her legs unsteady but her purpose clear. "I need to clean up and gather the documents. Can you ride, after I've checked the horses and made sure the fire's contained?" Caleb caught her arm gently. "Margaret. Thank you. For coming back. For risking," his voice caught. "Thank you, thank me by surviving this." Margaret covered his hand with hers briefly. "We'll discuss the rest after Mitchell's dealt with." She left him standing in the firelight, surrounded by the ruins of his barn and the men who depended on him, and walked toward the house with purpose burning in her chest hotter than any fire. Thomas Mitchell had made his final mistake. He'd forced Margaret to choose between staying safe and protecting what mattered. And he'd obviously never met a woman who'd spent 5 years learning that safety was an illusion anyway. 2 hours later, cleaned and dressed and carrying a portfolio of documents that represented Mitchell's complete destruction, Margaret rode beside Caleb through the darkness toward the Mitchell property. 3 ranch hands accompanied them, armed but under strict orders not to shoot unless absolutely necessary. "This is insane," Caleb said for the 3rd time. "He could have us shot the moment we arrive. He won't. Too many witnesses. Too much documentation already sent to others." Margaret kept her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "Mitchell's smart enough to know that making martyrs of us would end him faster than anything else." "You hope, I know." Margaret glanced at him. "Trust me, with my life, apparently. Since we've established I'm willing to run into burning buildings for you." There was dark humor in his voice. "Though I'd appreciate it if you didn't make a habit of following me into infernos, only when absolutely necessary." Margaret's lips quirked despite the tension. "I'm practical, not suicidal." They reached Mitchell's property near midnight. Unlike Caleb's working ranch, this was a showplace, a house built to impress rather than function, with columns and excessive windows and architecture that belonged in Virginia rather than Montana territory. Lights blazed in the windows. Apparently Mitchell wasn't sleeping either. A man with a rifle appeared as they approached. "State your business." Margaret hailed to see Mr. Mitchell on urgent business. Margaret's voice was calm, professional. "He'll want to hear what I have to say." The guard looked uncertain. A woman demanding an audience at midnight wasn't standard procedure. But something in Margaret's bearing, or perhaps the armed men flanking her, convinced him to take the request seriously. Wait here. 10 minutes later, they were being led into a parlor that screamed of wealth deployed as weapon. Mitchell stood near a fireplace, a drink in his hand, his expression equal parts curious and contemptuous. He was younger than Margaret expected, perhaps 45, and handsome in a way that suggested he was very aware of the fact. Mrs. Hale. Mr. Whitmore. His voice was smooth as expensive whiskey. I must admit, I didn't expect you to come calling, after you burned my barn. Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. Perhaps you had a careless ranch hand. Mitchell's smile was calculated cruelty. Fires happen all the time on working ranches. Stop. Margaret set her portfolio on a table with enough force to make Mitchell's eyes narrow. We're not here to trade accusations. We're here to offer you something you won't get anywhere else. And what's that? A way out. Margaret opened the portfolio, spreading documents across the expensive wood. These detail every illegal action you've taken in the last 2 decades. The predatory lending. The market manipulation. The coordination with suppliers to force bankruptcies. Every contract violated. Every law broken. Every man destroyed. Mitchell barely glanced at the papers. Impressive fiction, it's documented fact. Witnessed. Notarized. Currently held by 3 separate parties with instructions to release to newspapers and territorial authorities if anything happens to us. Margaret met his eyes. You've been careful, Mr. Mitchell. But not careful enough. And you made one critical error. What's that? You underestimated what people would do when they're desperate enough. Carson sang like a canary the moment he understood you'd destroy him anyway. So did your lumber supplier in Denver. So did the banker you tried to bribe into refusing Caleb's refinancing. Margaret's voice was steel. You built your empire on fear. But fear makes people unpredictable when they're cornered. Mitchell's expression finally shifted. Not fear. Not quite. But calculation. The smile faded into something harder, more genuine. What do you want? You drop all claims against Caleb's ranch. You stop interfering with his business. You leave this territory entirely. Margaret kept her voice level. In exchange, these documents stay sealed. Your reputation remains intact. You get to start over somewhere else without the weight of your past actions following you. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning, every newspaper from Helena to San Francisco receives complete documentation of your crimes. The territorial judge receives a formal complaint. The federal authorities who oversee banking practices receive evidence of fraud. Margaret paused. Your life as you know it ends. You'll face criminal charges. Prison, possibly. At minimum, social and financial ruin. Mitchell stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, the sound genuine and surprised. You're remarkable. I can see why Whitmore's kept you around. You're absolutely ruthless beneath all that propriety. I'm practical. There's a difference. Margaret refused to be flattered or intimidated. Do we have an agreement? You really think I'll just walk away? From land that should have been mine. Mitchell's voice hardened. This ranch, this territory, my father built it. Some drunk gambled it away and Whitmore stole it. I've spent 20 years trying to get back what's rightfully mine. It was never yours. Caleb spoke for the first time since entering, his voice quiet but absolute. Your father lost it legally. I bought it legally. You've spent 20 years nursing a grievance that has no basis in reality. Reality is what men make it. Mitchell's hands clenched around his glass. And I've made it my reality to destroy you, then you're about to fail. Margaret's voice cut through the tension. Because even if you burn every building, kill every animal, salt every field, you won't break Caleb Whitmore. And you certainly won't break us together. So make your choice, Mr. Mitchell. Walk away with your dignity intact, or lose everything in pursuit of something that was never yours to begin with. The silence in the parlor was profound. Outside, Montana night sounds drifted through expensive windows. Inside, 3 people stood locked in a moment that would determine the fate of everything Caleb had built. Mitchell finally set down his glass. You're bluffing. No one could have gathered that much evidence without my knowledge. Tell yourself that if it helps. Margaret gathered the documents, returning them to her portfolio. But when the newspapers arrive tomorrow, when the judge sends his summons, when your associates start distancing themselves to avoid being caught in the scandal, remember that I gave you this chance. She turned toward the door. Caleb followed. They made it halfway across the parlor before Mitchell spoke again. Wait, Margaret stopped but didn't turn around. If I agree, Mitchell said slowly, what guarantee do I have that you'll keep your word? That these documents stay sealed, you have my word. Margaret looked back at him over her shoulder. I know that probably seems worthless. But unlike you, Mr. Mitchell, I keep my promises. Because integrity is the only currency that actually matters. Mitchell stared at her, then at Caleb, then at the empty space where the documents had been. Margaret watched the war play out across his face. Pride versus survival. Revenge versus reason. 6 months, he finally said. Give me 6 months to arrange my affairs. To sell my holdings without suspicion. To relocate with my reputation intact. 3 months. Margaret's voice was firm. Long enough to do it properly. Short enough that you can't cause more damage. 4 months. Final offer. Margaret looked at Caleb. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. 4 months, Margaret agreed. But if you make any move against this ranch or its people during that time, the agreement is void. We'll bury you so fast you won't know what happened. I believe you would. Mitchell moved to a desk, pulling out paper. I'll sign a letter of agreement. Witnessed. Binding. They spent the next 30 minutes drafting terms that would protect the ranch while giving Mitchell time to retreat with grace. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't satisfying in the way destroying him immediately might have been. But it was strategic. Smart. The kind of victory that lasted. As they rode away from Mitchell's showplace toward the ranch, dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Caleb reached over and took Margaret's hand. We did it, he said quietly. We actually did it, we survived. Margaret squeezed his hand. There's a difference, is there? Caleb pulled his horse closer to hers. Because right now, with you beside me and the ranch safe and the future actually possible, it feels like more than survival. Margaret looked at him in the gray pre-dawn light. His face was still marked with soot, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke, his hands burned from pulling horses from fire. He was exhausted and battered and absolutely beautiful. It does, doesn't it? She whispered. Stay, Caleb said. Not a question. A plea. Not as an employee. Not for the trial period. Stay because you want to. Because this, he gestured at the endless prairie awakening around them, because this could be home. If you let it, Margaret's throat tightened. Home. She'd almost forgotten what that word meant. But looking at Caleb, at the land they just fought to protect, at the possibility stretching before them like the prairie itself, she felt something unlock in her chest. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll stay. Caleb's smile was sunrise itself. He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, gentle and sure, a promise and a beginning. Behind them, the ranch hands politely looked away, giving them privacy in the middle of endless openness, and Margaret, for the first time in 5 years, felt like she'd finally come home. The ranch hands who'd accompanied them that night never spoke of the kiss they'd witnessed. But word traveled anyway in the way it always did in close quarters. By the time Margaret and Caleb returned to the ranch that dawn, exhausted and smoke-stained and holding hands like they'd never learned to let go, Wu had coffee waiting and a look in his eyes that suggested he'd been expecting this development for weeks. "About time," was all he said, pouring 2 cups. "Breakfast in 30 minutes. You both look like death," Margaret laughed, surprising herself with the sound. When had she last laughed freely, without calculation or fear? She couldn't remember. But standing in Wu's kitchen with Caleb's hand warm in hers and the future suddenly possible instead of just survivable. Laughter felt natural as breathing. "We should clean up," Caleb said reluctantly, not releasing her hand. "Face the day properly, we should." Margaret didn't move either. In a minute, they stood there in the dawnlit kitchen, just being together, until Wu made a pointed throat-clearing sound and they finally separated. Margaret climbed the stairs to her small room feeling lighter than she had in years, despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. She washed the soot from her face and hands, changed into a clean dress, and sat on her bed for a moment just letting herself feel. The fear was still there. She'd learned too well that happiness could be yanked away without warning. But beneath the fear was something stronger. Hope. Real hope, rooted in something solid. Caleb had asked her to stay. Not as an employee, but as a partner. As someone who belonged, and she'd said yes. The implications of that yes would take time to understand fully. But for now, it was enough to know that she'd chosen life over safety, connection over isolation, risk over the slow death of invisibility. Downstairs, the ranch was already alive with activity despite the early hour. Men moved between buildings, assessing damage from the fire, planning reconstruction. The burned barn stood as a blackened skeleton against the morning sky, but instead of devastation, Margaret saw opportunity. They'd rebuild stronger. Better. Because that's what survival required. Caleb found her as she stood surveying the wreckage, 2 fresh cups of coffee in his hands. "Wu says if we don't eat, he's coming after us with a ladle, then we'd better eat." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully. "Have you slept at all, have you?" "That's not an answer, neither was yours." Caleb's lips quirked. "We're going to have to get better at taking care of ourselves if this partnership is going to work." Partnership. The word settled between them, comfortable and frightening all at once. Margaret sipped her coffee, studying Caleb's profile in the morning light. The exhaustion lines around his eyes. The burns on his hands from last night's rescue. The absolute certainty in his bearing that they would survive this, rebuild this, make something better from the ashes. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "The personal part. I understand the business. The numbers, the strategy, the work. But the rest, neither do I." Caleb met her eyes. "I haven't let anyone close in 15 years. I barely remember how to be anything except alone. But we'll figure it out together. Same way we figured out how to save this ranch, one crisis at a time." Margaret's voice held dry humor. "Exactly." He smiled, then sobered. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. This isn't gratitude. It's not relief that you saved the ranch. It's not proximity or stress or any of the things you're afraid it is. Then what is it?" She needed to hear him say it clearly, without romance or poetry. "Just truth, it's recognition." Caleb set down his coffee, turning to face her fully. "It's realizing that the person standing beside me isn't just competent or useful or any of those bloodless words. It's realizing that you're the first person in 15 years who makes me want to share things. Who makes silence comfortable instead of lonely. Who makes me think about futures that include more than just surviving." Margaret's throat tightened. "Caleb, I'm not asking for promises you're not ready to make. I'm not asking you to be something you're not." His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together naturally. "I'm just asking you to stay open to possibility. To let this grow at whatever pace feels right. Can you do that?" She thought about Philadelphia. About 5 years of invisibility, of being useful but never valued, of believing that her life's meaningful chapters had already been written. She thought about the journey west, about taking a chance on something that had seemed desperate and possibly foolish. She thought about the moment she'd run back into the burning barn because the thought of losing Caleb had been unbearable. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "I can do that." The kiss that followed was softer than the one on the prairie, more tender, like they were both still learning the shape of this new thing between them. When they pulled apart, both smiled like fools. "Boss." Tommy's voice shattered the moment. "Boss, you need to see this." They found Tommy at the north fence line, where a wagon waited loaded with lumber. Two men stood beside it looking uncomfortable. As Margaret and Caleb approached, she recognized them as Mitchell's employees. "Mr. Whitmore, ma'am," the older one said, removing his hat. "Mr. Mitchell sent us with materials for rebuilding your barn. He said to tell you it's part of the agreement." Good faith gesture. Caleb looked at Margaret. Eyebrows raised. "Did you negotiate that?" "No. But I may have suggested that visible cooperation would help his reputation when he relocates." Margaret studied the lumber, doing quick calculations. "This is quality material. Enough for a full rebuild, with excess. Mitchell said to tell you he keeps his word too," the younger man added. "Said you'd understand." Margaret did understand. This wasn't just lumber. It was Mitchell acknowledging that he'd been beaten by someone who understood strategy better than he did. It was surrender dressed as cooperation. It was the closest thing to respect a man like Thomas Mitchell could offer. "Tell Mr. Mitchell his gesture is appreciated," Caleb said carefully. "And that will hold up our end of the agreement." The men unloaded the lumber and left quickly, clearly uncomfortable being on Whitmore property. As they disappeared down the road, Caleb turned to Margaret with something like awe in his expression. "You turned our worst enemy into a supplier. I turned a destructive situation into a productive one." Margaret walked to the lumber, running her hand over the smooth wood. Mitchell needed to save face. We needed building materials. Everyone wins. You're extraordinary. Caleb said it like a revelation, like he was still discovering new facets of her and would be for years. "Do you know that?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm practical, you're both." He pulled her close, right there in front of Tommy and whoever else might be watching. "And I'm keeping you." "Possessive, Mr. Whitmore?" "Absolutely, Mrs. Hale." His smile was warm, intimate. "Get used to it." The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt almost dangerously normal. Margaret worked through the ranch accounts, finding efficiencies and opportunities that Samuel had missed. Caleb handled the physical operation while increasingly deferring to Margaret's judgment on financial decisions. They took meals together, worked late into evenings side by side, rode out to inspect operations with an ease that suggested years of partnership rather than weeks. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Margaret discovered that Caleb was surprisingly tender despite his rough exterior. That he worried about his men like they were family. That he could be funny in a dry way that caught her off guard. That he touched her whenever possible, a hand on the small of her back, fingers brushing hers when passing documents, casual contact that made her feel seen in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Caleb learned that Margaret was fierce about protecting what she cared about. That she had a gift for seeing patterns others missed. That she was deeply kind beneath all her practicality. That she needed reassurance sometimes, needed to be told she was wanted and valued. Needed patience as she learned to trust that this wasn't temporary. They didn't rush intimacy beyond kisses and careful touches. Both understood that building something real required foundation, not just passion. And both carried enough wounds that moving slowly felt less like caution and more like wisdom. 6 weeks after the barn fire, Margaret stood in the rebuilt structure, larger and better designed than the original, and felt satisfaction settle deep in her bones. The ranch was stabilizing. The debts were manageable. Mitchell had kept his word, maintaining distance while quietly selling his holdings. And she, Margaret Hale, had become indispensable in ways that had nothing to do with fear or desperation. Beautiful, isn't it? Caleb appeared beside her, surveying their work. Better than before, everything's better than before. Margaret didn't just mean the barn. Though I never imagined this when I arrived, what did you imagine, honestly? I imagined working hard, proving my worth, and maybe earning enough respect to not be dismissed on sight. Margaret leaned against him, the gesture still new enough to feel daring. I didn't imagine partnership. Or happiness. Or love. Caleb said the word carefully, like he was testing its weight. Margaret's breath caught. They'd danced around the word for weeks, both feeling it but neither quite brave enough to speak it. Love was huge. Love was terrifying. Love meant vulnerability neither had allowed themselves in years. Yes, she whispered. That, good. Caleb turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Because I love you, Margaret Hale. I'm not entirely sure when it happened, maybe when you faced down Carson, maybe when you ran into a burning barn, maybe when you first told me my accounts were a disaster. But it happened. And I'm done pretending it didn't. Margaret's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. I love you too. And it terrifies me because I don't trust happiness anymore. I keep waiting for it to be taken away, I know. I wait for the same thing. Caleb's forehead touched hers. But maybe that's what makes this real. We're both too old, too wounded, too experienced to have easy love. What we have is earned. Built from survival and choice and work. That's stronger than the alternative, is it enough? Margaret's voice cracked. What if we're too damaged? What if we are damaged? Caleb cut her off gently. We're scarred and cautious and we've both learned that nothing lasts forever. But Margaret, what we've built here, this partnership, this trust, this love, it's not about forever. It's about choosing each other today. And tomorrow. And the day after that. For as long as we're both brave enough to keep choosing, Margaret kissed him then, pouring into it everything she couldn't say. The fear and hope and desperate want for this to be real. The gratitude for being seen. The wonder that at 52, she could feel things she'd thought dead. The love that had grown despite her best efforts to protect herself from it. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. Marry me, Caleb said. Margaret's heart stopped. What, marry me? Not because it's expected or practical or any of those logical reasons. Marry me because I want you beside me legally. Officially. Because I want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours. His hands cupped her face. Because at 56 years old, I finally found someone worth risking everything for. Say yes, Margaret's mind raced through 1,000 objections. They'd known each other less than 3 months. Society would judge, a widow marrying so soon, at her age, with her appearance. There were practical considerations about property and finances. There were, yes, she heard herself say, because all the objections were just fear dressed as logic. Yes, I'll marry you. Caleb's smile was brilliant. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in the barn like they were young instead of middle-aged, like love hadn't learned to be careful yet. Margaret laughed, the sound echoing off the new walls, and for a moment she felt genuinely young. Not in body but in spirit. Like life was just beginning instead of winding down, when he set her down. They were both grinning like fools. We should tell Wu, Margaret said, still breathless. Before the whole ranch knows from gossip, the whole ranch probably already knows. Tommy has the subtlety of a thunderstorm. Caleb kept his arms around her. But yes, we should tell Wu properly. He'll want to cook something elaborate and disapprove of our timing and secretly be pleased. They walked to the main house hand in hand, and Margaret realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this light. Wu took the news exactly as predicted, pursing his lips and muttering about hasty decisions while his eyes crinkled with pleasure, and immediately began planning a feast, small wedding. Margaret insisted. Just ranch people. Nothing fancy, whatever you want. Caleb squeezed her hand. Though you deserve fancy if you want it, I want real. I want people who matter. Margaret stopped, emotion choking her. I want to stop being afraid this will disappear. It won't disappear. Caleb's voice was firm. I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. We're building something that lasts. They married 3 weeks later under the open Montana sky, with the ranch hands as witnesses and Wu officiating because the nearest preacher was 2 days' ride and neither wanted to wait. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that she'd made herself. Caleb wore his best shirt and actually combed his hair. Tommy cried, which made several other ranch hands cry, which made Wu threaten everyone with his ladle. It was perfect. That night, in Caleb's bedroom that would now be theirs, they came together with a tenderness that made Margaret's chest ache. There was awkwardness. Both were out of practice, both carried insecurities about aging bodies. But there was also laughter and patience and the profound intimacy of being truly seen by another person. I love you, Caleb whispered against her skin, the words of benediction. I love you, Margaret replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Afterward, wrapped in quilts with Caleb's arm around her and the prairie wind singing outside, Margaret felt peace settle into her bones. Not the peace of resignation. The peace of arriving somewhere she belonged. What are you thinking? Caleb asked sleepily. That I spent 5 years believing my life was over. That the meaningful parts were finished. That I just exist until I didn't. Margaret traced patterns on his chest. And then I came here. And you infuriated me and challenged me and saw me. And everything changed. I spent 15 years believing I was better off alone. Caleb's hand stroked her hair. Safer that way. Less risk of pain. And then you arrived, all sharp edges and hidden strength, and made me remember that safety isn't the same as living. We're quite the pair. Margaret smiled in the darkness. 2 wounded people learning to trust again. The best kind of pair. Caleb pulled her closer. Because we know how rare this is. How precious. We won't take it for granted. Margaret drifted toward sleep, feeling held in ways that had nothing to do with physical touch. Held by commitment. By choice. By the knowledge that she'd found someone who understood that love after 50 wasn't diminished by age, it was refined by it. Strengthened by experience and loss and the hard-won wisdom of survival. The months that followed brought their own challenges. Ranch life was never easy, and financial stability required constant vigilance. There were hard seasons and difficult decisions. There were moments when Margaret doubted herself. When old fears whispered that this couldn't last. There were moments when Caleb withdrew into himself, old habits of isolation rising up, but they worked through it. Together. Always together, Margaret became the ranch's undisputed authority on business matters. Suppliers learned quickly that trying to cheat her was futile. Buyers discovered that her negotiation skills were legendary. The ranch not only stabilized but thrived, growing in ways that went beyond mere financial success. Caleb softened in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. He laughed more. Delegated more. Trusted more. The legendary lone wolf became a man who built partnerships, who valued input, who understood that strength sometimes meant accepting help. And together, they built something extraordinary. A year after Margaret's arrival, she stood on the porch at sunset watching Caleb ride in from the north pasture. He saw her waiting and his face transformed, that smile she loved appearing like sunrise. He dismounted and climbed the steps to where she stood, pulling her into his arms without a word. Good day? Margaret asked, leaning into his warmth. Better now. Caleb kissed the top of her head. Carson paid off his debt early. The new supplier from Denver offered better terms than expected. And I found a way to expand our markets into California. Margaret smiled against his chest. So yes. Good day, you're remarkable. He said it like he said it every day. Because he did. Have I mentioned that lately? Not in the last 3 hours. Margaret pulled back to look at him. You're falling behind, Mr. Whitmore, unacceptable. Let me remedy that. Caleb kissed her thoroughly, right there on the porch where anyone could see. You're remarkable. You're brilliant. You're the best thing that ever happened to this ranch and to me. You're enough. Margaret laughed, her cheeks warm. You're going to make Wu nauseated. Wu loves it. He told me yesterday that watching us makes him believe in second chances. Caleb kept his arms around her. Smart man, Wu. They stood together in the fading light, watching the prairie turn gold and amber. The ranch spread around them, buildings they'd rebuilt, fences they'd mended, cattle they'd saved, an empire they'd preserved through intelligence and determination and partnership. But more than that, they'd built a life. A real life, messy and complicated and absolutely worth fighting for. Do you ever regret it? Margaret asked quietly. Choosing me. Choosing this, every single day. Caleb's deadpan delivery made her pull back indignantly until she saw his smile. I regret that I wasted 15 years being alone when I could have been looking for you. I regret that we didn't have 30 years together instead of however many we get. I regret every moment before you walked into my office and changed everything. That's not what I meant. But Margaret's throat was tight with emotion. I know what you meant. And no. Never. Not even for a second. Caleb's hand cupped her face. Margaret, you saved more than my ranch. You saved me from a life of just existing. You taught me that it's never too late to choose life over safety. To choose love over fear. To choose partnership over isolation. You taught me the same things. Margaret covered his hand with hers. You taught me that being useful isn't the same as being valued. That I could be wanted for more than what I could do. That love doesn't have an expiration date. Damn right it doesn't. Caleb kissed her again, slow and sweet. We're proof of that. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of fire. Inside, Wu was preparing supper. In the bunkhouse, ranch hands were settling in for the evening. In the barn, horses nickered contentedly. The ranch breathed around them, alive and thriving, and Margaret Hale Whitmore, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, no longer just surviving, stood in her husband's arms and felt utterly, completely home. What are you thinking now? Caleb asked, his voice warm with affection, that I'm 53 years old, and I'm happier than I've ever been in my life. Margaret looked up at him. That love doesn't diminish with age. It just gets better. Deeper. More real, it does, doesn't it? Caleb's eyes held everything they'd built together. And we have years ahead of us to keep discovering that, years of crisis management and financial strategy and hard work. Margaret smiled. Sounds perfect, with you. Always. Caleb took her hand, leading her toward the door. Now come on. Wu's made something elaborate, and if we're late, he'll threaten us with kitchen implements. They went inside together, into warmth and light and a life they'd built from ashes. Behind them, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, constant and unchanging. But they had changed. They'd learned that survival wasn't enough. That being useful wasn't the same as being valued. That love, real love, the kind built on respect and partnership and choosing each other every single day, didn't diminish with age, it was refined by it. Strengthened by experience and loss and the hard-won wisdom of knowing that some things only got better with time, some things, like love that waited patiently through years of loneliness, were worth every scar, every doubt, every moment of fear. Some things were worth choosing, again and again, for as long as you were brave enough to keep choosing, and Margaret and Caleb chose each other. Every day. In every way that mattered, not because it was easy, but because it was real. And real, they'd learned, was worth everything.